everyone wants to build a generative AI powered application. What most people end up doing is building a RAG architecture, which is Retrieval Augmented Generation. In case you're not aware of what that is, just check the link above. I've done a very beginner friendly introduction into RAG architecture and the concept around it. This video is a step up from there, and this is still very beginner friendly. But I want to talk about how to take a RAG architecture to production and what are the things you need to keep in mind when you are building your system using LLMs, generative AI, and passing your own or context in combination and calling it a RAG. All right, so that's what this video is about. Stick till the very end. There's 2 slides essentially that I'm going to talk through. Coming back, welcome back to the channel. If you are a regular visitor, thank you for coming back to the content. If you are new, I talk a lot about software architecture, enterprise architecture, basically sharing my experience around building softwares, predominantly AI systems and analytic. Stay tuned for this video, right? So what is RAG? Now, RAG essentially stands for Retrieval Augmented Generation. So let's say you want to build a simple bot, chat bot, which is powering your enterprise queries backed up by data. So there's an HR chatbot, it needs access to your HR policies, documents, guide. There's a manufacturing chatbot which plant users are using, it needs access to those SOPs, those standard operating procedures. You want a consumer facing chatbot, it needs to have access to the data for the customer, where, so that you can personalize the chats. It needs to have access to past purchases and things like that. So RAG is essentially bringing together your data, your context, and augmenting that with an LLM and then presenting a good interface. That's the chat based problem. Now, how do you do it? Let's just go with the flow. The things in blue, the circles in blue are essentially the usual flow. I'm going to talk about a bunch of extra items towards the end. Again, stick till the very end. There's about 8-10 key areas that are critical to building RAG architectures. The first is a user hits a query, it goes to an orchestrator, very typical, something like a LangChain. And what an orchestrator does is it does a bunch of things, does some coordination, communication, etc. And usually we just hit it directly. That's a mistake. We need to think a little more deeper, and we'll get back to this. The second path is you go to something like a prompt store where you have a reusable prompt interface, or a cache where you have saved previous questions, answers. And this is a different kind of cache. This is not a deterministic cache where you have a key value, you solve the value. This is more like a similarity cache. So when somebody asks a question, you probably want to see that, all right, the answer that I have stored in my memory of the cache is 90% same. So let me just try that and give it back, right? So it's a different kind of cache. Then you move on to your chain and then you go into doing preprocessing. Preprocessing is again new, different. Same story wrapped under a newer umbrella. You are doing more unstructured data. You want to do different kind of joins. You want to do different kind of cleanups. You have things like chunking strategies in place. You have newer problems to deal with like tokens, Kesebana, and all of that. So essentially trying to make a sense of some data. Then you move forward down the line. You do something like an embedding model. And in an embedding model, you go and basically transform the data, make it into some sort of a vector. You use OpenAI vector encodings, or you use some Hugging Face provided models and things like that. This is where your data is represented as vectors, and there's more connections possible with orchestrator or in some form. I've been not very strict with the arrows. I've written RAG 0.0001 version. Maybe something even running in a Jupyter notebook, not really focused on a system perspective. Then the orchestrator will have access to knowledge base. Obviously, that's the knowledge base, which is more enterprise context. It can be fetched by the orchestrator, passed through the pre-processing, vectorized or not, depends. Then you have bottom something like a storage tier where you have different kind of storage capabilities. VectorDB is a new one. Graph database, if you're dealing with prompts and graph, they are evolving. RAG with graph is very evolving, interesting conversation. Then you have a document setup, right? And all of this is powered by something like a feedback loop, which goes back and tells your orchestrator this is working, not working, things like that. So that's RAG essentially. Retrieval-Augmented Generation, powered by very traditional stuff, which is pre-processing, cleaning of data, storing of data, and then there's some new bullets or new styles around the corner, which is embedding models, making vectors and all that. If you see the evolution of databases themselves, we started with files, then structured, then unstructured, and now we have purpose-built databases. We have time series databases, we have logging databases, we have graph databases. So vectors are a new kid in the block or new kind of data in itself, not just a paradigm of storage. It's actually becoming a data type, very much char, var, so who knows that this might become a standard offering in most databases, and that's a trend that is picking up. All right. So that's a little bit about RAG. Don't call your orchestrator directly, bring a gateway in between. Either bring an API gateway, but the bottom line is if you have APIs, follow the traditional route, get an API gateway. Security needs to be very strong focus, not just RBAC, not just, auth, but model security, data security. This is not a model which you have trained or you have a good understanding of. So it better be sound, it better not be full of biases. So you want to build systems or conversations within your setup or code in your setup essentially to be able to talk about that. Caches, again, always happening, very important. Feedback loops, a different kind of feedback loop. You want to evaluate how your prompts are, you want to evaluate how your different models are performing basis the kind of questions. BVR, business value realization, very difficult to solve for GenAI use cases because largely centered around productivity, but important. Scalability is different. Obviously, scale is always complex, but data processing pipelines are different because unstructured data is flowing in. So the kind of transformations you are doing is slightly different compared to the traditional ones. Integration with your enterprise knowledge base. Usually, you would need all the data in a place to be able to vectorize, search, and all that, and that's also not pretty common. You're now dealing with different model providers, a lot more vendors, so all of that has to be managed. There's obviously ethical conversations, governance conversations needs to be having. We need to build those setups. Finally, the two important point, right? UX, you have a chat interface. What do you really do with a UX, right? If you have a UI, you can do a bunch of different things, play around with them, and build interesting options for the users to play around to get engaged. What do you do with chat interfaces? So that's a very evolving thought. How do you present chat interfaces? Do you present them as extensions within your existing tool? Are they standalone application? Are they maybe even part of some sort of a bot-based framework? So there's different forms of collaboration happening. Finally, and the most important thing which I feel is existing right now, there's a hype. And as with all hype, your managers, your bosses, your CXOs, your C-suite, basically leadership hears about these cool terms and they expect you to solve for it. Now, that expectation management is a critical piece of the conversation. How do you deal with it is another video. Until then, bye bye. Thank you for listening to it. Hope you are able to push RAG architectures into production. I would suggest follow an 80-20. The area is very evolving. You can't literally keep up with it. So 20% of your time goes towards research, 80% implementation. If you have deeper questions, put in comments. Until next video, bye bye.